Welcome to The Explainer. So, here's a thought. What happens when a global superpower starts to feel its grip on the world slipping? What if it turns on its own friends to stay afloat? Well, today we're digging into a really provocative analysis that claims the US is doing exactly that, writing a playbook to, essentially, take the wealth of its closest allies. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll get into the pretty shocking financial claim at the heart of all this. Then, we'll look at the so-called declining empire playbook and see if there's any historical precedent. From there, we'll see how this analysis applies to Europe and why India is presented as a totally different story. And finally, we'll zoom out and talk about what this could all mean for the future of global power. So, where does this whole idea come from? Well, it all kicks off with a really extraordinary statement, one that was reportedly made by someone who could potentially be a future US Treasury Secretary. And this is the quote. The source we're looking at presents this as Exhibit A, a plan to basically control the wealth of allies like the EU and Japan. And the language used is just incredibly blunt. Offshore appropriation. I mean, there's no hiding what that means. The source even notes that the person who heard this was apparently just, stunned into silence. So what in the world is offshore appropriation? Well, according to this analysis, it's pretty simple. It's seizure. It's taking something that belongs to someone else. The source even compares it to a kind of modern digital colonialism. You don't have to send warships anymore. You just, reroute the money. Okay, so here's the alleged mechanics of it, the step-by-step. The idea is that all this surplus wealth that allies like Japan and the EU have built up over decades, it would get funneled into a brand new US sovereign wealth fund. And this fund, it would be controlled by the US, with the specific goal of rebuilding American industry. And who gets to decide how to spend it? The US president. Now, you might be thinking this sounds completely unprecedented, right? A totally new, radical idea. But the analysis we're examining argues, nope, not at all. In fact, it's presented as a classic move, something straight out of a playbook for declining empires. And it draws this really interesting parallel to the British Empire right after World War II. And this is the heart of that playbook, the key pattern. When a big power starts to decline and it can't push its adversaries around anymore, who does it turn on? According to this theory, it turns on its friends. It squeezes its own allies because, they're the easiest targets. And this is where the comparison gets really specific. The source basically lays it out side by side. On one hand, you've got the British Empire after the war. Their policy was the sterling area. It forced their allies and colonies to hold their cash reserves in pounds sterling, which helped finance Britain's massive debts. Now, look at the alleged U.S. plan. The policy is offshore appropriation, and the mechanism, forcing allies to invest in a U.S. sovereign fund. It's the same alleged goal, financing the home country's recovery, just, with a different name. And to give you a sense of the scale here, this was not a small thing. According to the source, India alone was forced to hold 40% of all the sterling balances held by Britain's allies. Just think about that. So when Britain devalued the pound by 30% in 1949, poof, a massive chunk of India's national wealth vanished, essentially overnight, all to prop up the British economy. Okay, so that historical parallel brings us right to the present day, and to the analysis's main case study, Europe. The argument here is pretty stark, that Europe essentially being treated like a modern-day colony. And the source we're looking at here makes a really, really sharp, ironic point. It throws back to the 1884 Berlin Conference, where European powers literally drew lines on a map of Africa and decided the fate of an entire continent. The argument now is that the tables have turned, that today it's Europe that's finding its own economic destiny being decided for it by an outside power. So how did Europe get into this position, according to the analysis? It all comes down to dependency. The argument is that its military dependence on the US through NATO has left it without the ability to really chart its own course. And that strategic weakness, the source claims, is what opens the door to what it calls economic plunder. Its wealth now becomes the target because it can't defend itself economically. But, okay, not everyone is in the same position as Europe or Japan. The analysis then pivots and holds up India as a major contrast, a country on a completely different path. And here you can really see the difference, laid out plain and simple. On one side, you have Europe and Japan, which this analysis sees as dependent on the US for military protection. On the other side, you have India. And the key phrase here is strategic autonomy. The source argues this isn't just luck, it's the result of decades of deliberate policy, of non-alignment and focusing on military self-reliance. A huge part of that autonomy, a really critical piece, is economic. The source points out that exports to the US only make up about 2% of India's GDP. That's it. So that economic diversification, it's like a shield. It means India just isn't as vulnerable to the kind of economic arm twisting that other nations might be. So you can see this path to independence is built on some really solid pillars. It starts with its long-held policy of non-alignment. Then there's its modern push for military self-reliance, what they call Atmanirbhar. You add in its diverse global partnerships and its ambitions to be a leader in its own right in the global south and with BRICS, and the source argues it becomes politically impossible for India to ever accept a subordinate role. So, that brings us to the big question. Why? What's the supposed driver behind such an aggressive financial strategy? Well, in this final section, we're going to connect this claim to the massive pressures the US is reportedly facing and what that signals about the future of power in the world. And, according to this analysis, a huge part of the answer comes down to one absolutely staggering number, $38 trillion. That's roughly the size of the US national debt. The argument is that a debt that massive creates a kind of desperate, urgent need to find new sources of financing wherever they can be found. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this source's perspective. A move like offshore appropriation isn't a sign of confidence or strength. It's the opposite. It's a symptom of decline, the kind of frantic move a power makes when its global influence is fading and it has to resort to just taking wealth from those who are in no position to refuse. And so all of this leaves us with a huge, lingering question. If this analysis of a shifting world is even partly right, as the old empires fade, who gets to write the new rules? Who has both the power and, just as importantly, the independence to shape what comes next?